Hello everyone, it's 7 o'clock. This is Sky News Breakfast. More travel misery for holidaymakers this morning as Gatwick Airport announces it's going to be capping the number of flights during the summer because of staff shortages. It comes as the boss of Heathrow tells Sky News it'll take 12 to 18 months to get the industry back to pre-pandemic levels. We'll have more on that throughout the show. And temperatures have been running high here in Westminster, with the PM facing yet another bruising week. So what might the forecast have in store for the government ahead of two important by-elections? Lots to talk about when I'm joined by the Business Minister, Paul Scully, in just a moment. It's Friday, the 17th of June. More travel disruption as Gatwick Airport caps its summer departures, while the boss of Heathrow tells Sky News it'll take some time for the industry to get back to normal.
I think it'll take 12 to 18 months for the whole industry to get all of its capacity back to where it was before the pandemic.
Boris Johnson will today meet with a group of Tory MPs from the north of England as he looks to alleviate pressure on his premiership and the cost of living. Parts of the UK are set to hit 34 degrees today as the hot spell reaches its peak.
People at this West London Lido are hoping to cool down, with it forecast to be hotter here today than in the Caribbean.
A warning that the government is set to miss its targets for clean air as it struggles to tackle harmful pollution. New evidence given to Congress details how former President Donald Trump put his Vice President Mike Pence in danger while illegally pressuring him to overturn the election. Also coming up this morning, marked by an atomic era, we'll hear from some of those affected by Britain's first nuclear testing experiments and hear how they're calling on the government to honour survivors.
Baby, I'm amazed the way you love me all the time. And maybe I'm afraid of the way I love you.
An amazing 80 years of Paul McCartney. As the Beatle prepares to celebrate his birthday, we'll look back at his life with his brother Mike. Hello and a very good morning to you. Gatwick Airport has announced it'll be reducing the number of flights during the summer holiday period due to staff shortages. Britain's second largest airport will cut the number of flights from 900 a day to 825 in July and 850 in August. This comes as the head of Heathrow Airport told Sky News that air passengers could face disruption for up to 18 months. As Sky's business correspondent Paul Kelso reports.
For some travellers, the Jubilee was no cause for celebration, as cancellations and delays at airports turned the holiday into a weekend to forget. Heathrow avoided the half-term chaos, and they're confident they'll do so again this summer when numbers peak for the school holidays. Though the boss admits it will take time for the whole industry to recover from COVID.
Well, I think it'll take 12 to 18 months for the whole industry to get all of its capacity back to where it was before the pandemic. And that's not just across the UK, it has to be across Europe as well, because we are affected by staffing issues at other airports around the world. So this isn't quick. Very skilled jobs have been lost, and now we're having to, as an industry, recruit people back, train them up again to be able to serve passengers. And that just takes time. It's very easy to slam the brakes on the industry, lead to enormous job losses, but it's much harder to scale it up again when you suddenly open the doors again.
The airline industry was perhaps the most ravaged by COVID-19, ending international travel at a stroke, wiping out billions of pounds in revenue, and the return to normal has not been easy. The real test of how they're coping will come in a couple of short weeks once the school holidays and the summer travel season begins in earnest.
At Bristol Airport, passengers queued into the car park last month. To avoid a repeat, they're on a recruitment drive to fill more than 100 roles, including security, where training remains a challenge.
It can take up to 12 weeks to go through security and training, but we are able to do some training ahead of the actual start. an issue of the past. So we're working around it as best we can.
The real test of the industry's confidence and passenger patience is about to come. Paul Kelso, Sky News at Heathrow.
Well, the Small Business Minister, Paul Scully, is here with me. Very good morning to you. And so much to talk about this morning, but I do want to kick off with more travel chaos, as we're outlining this morning. The boss of Heathrow Airport, as you heard there, saying that that kind of disruption could last for 18 months. Gatwick Airport reducing the number of flights over the summer period. Should airports have been better prepared?
Well, I think we knew that the travel industry as a whole was already really hard pressed through COVID. And as you heard John Holland-Kaye there say, that when you start up anything almost from scratch, because there were very, very few flights going through Heathrow at some points, that it takes time to come through and upskill the staff, bring the staff back in. So our ministers, transport ministers, have been trying to work with Heathrow, Gatwick, or the other airport operators. We do want them to do more. We want to make sure that in a tight labour market there are enough people to staff the roles there, and we'll continue to work with them. But
you've got sympathy with them. You think that they couldn't have planned this any better? Well,
I'm not on the detail in terms of their day-to-day planning as a business minister, rather than a transport minister, but it is difficult. We've seen this in other sectors. That idea of scaling up again, having had almost mothballed the economy for 2 years. But in travel and airports, it's so important, because not only do we need to reinstall investment and travel from international travel coming in, but as you say, there's that pent-up demand for people to actually go out for the first time.
Well, there's so much demand. I mean, people have had a miserable time, haven't they? For many people, this is their first holiday they've had for years. And if they have the prospect of it being cancelled and having to rebook with inflation at 9% at the moment, they're going to have to pay more for another holiday. So what can the government do to help?
Well, this is why we want to work really closely with the airports and the airlines as well, to make sure that they are doing everything they can, and to see what more we can do from organisations like the Department for Work and Pensions, our work coaches, to make sure that in a tight labour market where people can work more hours if they're able to, and really matching up.
So that's the answer, is it? People have to just work hard?
Well, no, what I mean is that there are a record number of vacancies, 1.3 million vacancies across the country in all manner of sectors, but there are also people who have recalibrated what they want to do when they're on furlough, and we want to make sure that those people that are not necessarily working full-time through universal credit, we can get them back into work to be more productive if that suits them, and obviously match them up with the sectors where there are those vacancies.
OK, it sounds like you are saying you want people to work longer hours and
work harder. What I'm saying, we're not talking about going out and forcing people to do anything, but they just want to make sure that they're matched up properly, so that it's just that those people who can work longer, that want to work longer, can be better matched with the work coaches and work closely with their work coaches.
How bad is this going to get? We saw the Bank of England raising interest rates for the 5th consecutive month, warning of more rises ahead. Inflation, they say, could go up to 11%. How bad is the situation? Are we heading for a recession?
Well, I think what we are saying, we're trying to do everything we can to tackle the cost of living issues. This is a global situation. You've seen inflation in other countries, in America and other European countries, hitting similarly high figures and forecasts. So we've got to do everything we can to weather that storm. The Chancellor's put in £37 billion worth of support, and what you see that the £650 million that's going to a number of households will be hitting their bank accounts on the 14th of July.
It's not enough, though, is it?
You'll see the national insurance threshold changes actually delivering a tax cut next month as well. So we
know about that package, but there needs to be an overall economic strategy, doesn't there? I mean, these changes obviously will make a bit of a difference, but not enough of a difference to so many people.
What you saw the Chancellor do throughout COVID, you saw him flex as he saw what was happening on the ground, the feedback that was coming back, and tackling the very best data and forecasts. And he's doing a similar thing now. As I said, he's put £37 billion worth of immediate relief especially for the most vulnerable in our society. Anything we need to do fiscally around tax changes, that gets done in the autumn budget. So we'll make sure that we're listening, looking and responding.
What about help for people with mortgages? I mean, they're seeing interest rates go up. Is there anything that you can do to help people out who are on variable mortgages or looking to buy a house and get a new mortgage?
Well, I think in terms of, you know, buying a house and taking out new mortgages, people need to obviously do their own calculations and work with what they can afford. But as I say, in terms of existing householders and people's everyday bills, the Chancellor will look and respond accordingly. What we can't do, the government, he's already said, and he's absolutely right, the government can't solve every problem within this. He's not going to be able to save every business and work with everybody's individual costs, but we'll do everything we can within that, within the remit of keeping public finances tight as well, because we're actually servicing our debt, national debt, having just put £8 billion into the economy. We're paying something like £85 billion just to service our debt, not to go to schools, hospitals. We've got to keep that running as well.
Well, yes, and a lot of people think about their own personal debt, of course. What about tax cuts? I mean, this just isn't the environment for tax cuts, is it, with inflation looking like it could reach 11%?
Well, that's what I mean about the Chancellor looking at everything holistically. So come the next budget, he will have to look at the balance between...
But what do you think should happen? Rishi Sunak has said that tax cuts aren't on the cards now. Do you think that's the right move?
I think, you know, we are a low-tax government. I would like to see tax cuts...
We're not low-tax government at the moment, are you?
Well, no, because as I say, we've just put £408 billion into the economy. You know, that's my general principle, and the party's general principle is to have low taxes, to trust people to spend their own money the best way we can. But as I say, we've got to keep the NHS, we've got to get the backlog dealt with in the NHS, we've got to keep our schools well funded, all of those things in the public finances. It's a complex situation, and having put all that money in, the Chancellor can look, when it comes to the budget, and make his decision at that point.
But you think no tax cuts is the right way forward for now?
Well, what I don't want to do is write a budget months ahead of the budget. I'm just
no
saying,
announcements on tax cuts.
Well, there won't be tax cuts now because, as I say, that will be any taxes that are dealt with at a budget in the autumn. There's so much to go until we get to the autumn, and you know, things can change in any number of ways.
OK, I want to move on to the resignation of Lord Guide, Boris Johnson's ethics advisor. He released his, or rather the government released his resignation letter yesterday. Can you say in the light of that, without doubt, that you believe that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is a man who upholds the highest standards required of his office?
Yeah, I can. I think he's been clear in his approach and regarded to the fine that he received. I think Lord Guide seemed to have resigned on the discussion around when the Prime Minister asked him for advice for supporting our industries in the next few months.
Was it the steel industry, just to clarify?
Well, that's what I understand from the letter. Just reading the letter, I've not been part of the discussion, but I read the letters as they were released. That was my understanding about it. Now, clearly, those kind of discussions, if there are any, you know, I wouldn't want to speculate because that's obviously commercially sensitive stuff. But that's I have no more knowledge than that. But that seems to be where Lord Guide has finally taken his decision. But nonetheless, in terms of the Prime Minister's behaviour, you know, he rightly wants to draw a line under the so-called Partygate because people are worried more about what you've just been talking about, the cost of living, what's going to mean to their mortgages and their bills in the days and months ahead.
They want to feel that their Prime Minister is ethical too, don't they?
Yeah,
and
of course they do.
How will they view the fact that he's lost 2 ethics advisors in very quick succession? And Lord Guide, the last one to go, has said in his resignation letter that the Prime Minister put him in an impossible and odious position. This isn't someone who speaks out in this kind of language normally. Does that point to a Prime Minister who's got the highest ethical standards?
Well, I think my understanding of what I read when I read the letter was that was talking about advice that he'd asked him to give,
not about an impossible and odious position.
Yeah, which I can't really reconcile myself because that was about advice he's asked him on something else rather than what's happened around Partygate. But in terms of the fine the Prime Minister received, Sue Gray talked about leadership within Number 10 in the Cabinet Office, and there's been a raft of changes in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office in terms of organisation, in terms of changing that culture, changing that ethos, and Sue Gray herself said that she wants that needs time to bed in.
Lord Guide was clearly very frustrated with the whole way that was handled as well. So will there be another ethics advisor?
That I don't know. I mean, there's a number of questions that Lord Guyot has raised about the way that the way that system works, and that's right that Number 10 actually takes time to just look at that and work that through. So that'll be for them to announce.
Would anyone want to do the job? It looks like anyone who does the job is overruled by the Prime Minister.
No, well, it's, as I say, that I think that's part of the consideration is how the system works, and because we want to make it as efficient, working as best we can, and that's what the Prime Minister and Number 10 will consider. Would
you be comfortable if there was no ethics advisor? What kind of message do you think that would send out?
What I think I would be comfortable with, as long as there is a mechanism. There needs to be a mechanism clearly that the Prime Minister and that me as a minister are held to the highest standards. There is a ministerial code there, and we want to make sure that that it's adhered to, because that's the principles that we all stand on, not just as MPs when we first come into the House, but when we accept offices of state as ministers.
Do you think this should go to Parliament? Do you think this is something that MPs more broadly should decide on and make sure that there's a truly independent ethics advisor to keep the Prime Minister and the government in check?
I think it's difficult because you then get into positions where government governs and Parliament scrutinises that. Parliament will undoubtedly continue to debate this matter, but I'm not sure that that day-to-day running of government, the government is beholden to Parliament in that sort of slightly in that balance of power, as it were. That's sort of in our unwritten constitution. I'm not sure that's how it works.
We've had an extraordinary week in politics this week, haven't we? We've had the bill on the Northern Ireland Protocol. We've had the Rwanda policy seeing flights grounded by a court in Europe. Does the Prime Minister think he can breach whichever rules he wants and get away with it? Because the European Commission Vice President told our political editor that constant breaching of international law by the country is damaging UK-EU relationships.
That, I'm afraid, is just a repeat of sort of negotiating in public that we've seen over the last few years. I mean, I don't believe, and the government's been really clear, that the legislation that we've introduced doesn't breach international law, but nonetheless, actually, it's there as an insurance policy anyway. What we'd rather have is a negotiated settlement with the EU. We don't want to end up in trade wars and escalated disputes. We want to make sure that we can work together because this affects both sides. And so if we can have sensible conversations rather than, as I say, negotiating via the media or via social media and these kind of things, that's far better, not just for both sides, but for the businesses that are caught up in this as well.
OK, Paul Scully, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
So let's take a look now at the morning papers, shall we? And the Telegraph leads with the Bank of England predicting inflation will climb to 11% later this year, prompting the Chancellor to indicate that tax cuts will be put on hold. The Bank of England raising its interest base rate to the highest point since the start of 2009 is also on the front of the Metro with the headline, 11% hell is on the way. The Eye also leads on inflation, rocketing to 11% as ministers rule out personal tax cuts until 2024. Fears over rocketing inflation and tough times ahead also makes the front page of the Daily Mail. Boris Johnson is considering scrapping the role of ethics advisor after the resignation of Lord Guyot. That makes the front of The Guardian. There's your morning papers. Let's tell you what's still to come on the show. Later this hour, I'm going to be joined by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey. Also, Labour's Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, will be on the programme soon after 8. A NATO summit is set to take place in Madrid later this month, with Ukraine high on the agenda. The Spanish Foreign Minister will be with me to discuss those talks. Now, Britain is set for its hottest day of the year so far, with temperatures set to hit the mid-30s in some areas. The Met Office is describing the temperatures as rare for June and has issued level 3 alerts across the east and southeast of England. Well, the heat is spreading up from Europe, where it's even hotter, with areas of Spain set to hit 41 degrees and wildfires emerging in the northeast of the country. France has also been gripped by record-breaking temperatures, with French weather services reporting 40 degrees being hit for the first time ever in June, and highs of 39 degrees expected in southern France today. And it's in the south where it'll be the warmest here. Well, Sky's Saba Chowdhury joins me now from a Lido in West London. It must be very tempting to dive in, Saba, and the temperature's rising already, I guess, out there.
Good morning. Honestly, I cannot keep up with the weather in this country, but what I do know for sure is that places like this Lido are going to be ram-packed later today and also the rest of the week. We're talking about hotter than the Maldives and Jamaica, for goodness sake, with temperature in London going up to 34 degrees Celsius. That's also in East Anglia and in places across England and also Wales. We're talking between 27 to 30 degrees Celsius, making it potentially the hottest day of the year so far. But with severe weather warnings, we do also have heads up from some official bodies. So the London Fire Brigade, for example, have said that there are increased chances of things like fires at local playgrounds, parks, even in gardens at home. And also we have health experts warning that weather like this brings with it disrupted sleep, impact to cognitive performance, and also increased hospital rates for mental illness. Now, weather like this is rare, but it's certainly not unprecedented. And with climate change, we're looking at potentially more days like this.
Saba, thanks very much indeed, and maybe get in the shade. That's my little bit of advice. Very helpful. Saba, thank you. So let's take a look at some of the other headlines now. And a report from the National Audit Office has warned the government is not on track to meet its air pollution targets by 2030. It also found that the public are not being effectively informed about the issue and that large parts of the road network aren't in line with pollution limits. The head of the UK's armed forces has said Russia has already strategically lost the war in Ukraine. Admiral Sutonie Radakin also said that although Russia may achieve tactical successes in the coming weeks, any notion that the war had been a success was nonsense. The United States says it's aware of a photograph appearing to show two Americans captured after going to Ukraine to fight Russian forces. Alexander Druki and Andy Huyn, both from Alabama, have been missing for a week and their families fear that they have been captured. The Capitol Riot Committee has heard evidence that Donald Trump called his Vice President Mike Pence a wimp during his last-ditch efforts to overturn the 2020 election result. The committee also heard that Mr. Trump was repeatedly told that his plan to overturn the result was illegal. The lead Republican negotiator in the US Senate's efforts to agree a bipartisan gun safety bill walked out of the talks yesterday following hours of negotiations. The lead Democrat, however, remained optimistic that lawmakers could vote on legislation before the Senate left for a two-week July the 4th recess. Now, a new service launches today that allows deaf people to communicate with 999 operators using sign language. Previously, deaf people had to text emergency services in English, which for many is a second language. Sky's Madeleine Ratcliffe reports.
If you think of an emergency, there's a good chance this comes to mind. However, for the 12 million deaf people in the UK, there's no siren to say help is on its way, and making that 999 call isn't easy. But today, a new service launches for the thousands of deaf people who use British Sign Language, or BSL.
Ambulance, please. My dad's had a stroke.
One click of a button on the app connects users to a BSL interpreter via video link. Through them, they can talk to a 999 call handler in real time. Until now, deaf people have had to ask others to call for help or use a text-based system. This will be faster, but that's not all.
The biggest difference it's going to make is to give deaf people the independence to make those kind of calls themselves in a language which they are most comfortable in. And when you're distressed, you need to be able to communicate in your own language and not be trying to think of how to communicate in a different language.
Because English actually isn't the first language for many deaf people. British Sign Language is. So imagine trying to call an ambulance in French when you don't speak it, and then trying to get all the medical information you need across as quickly and accurately as possible. That's the situation Bryony found herself in when her husband suffered a severe allergic reaction out on a run.
I wasn't able to ring 999, and I thought about texting my mum to ask her to call 999, but then I thought that's going to take too much time, and then relaying the call. So I was really panicking. My husband couldn't breathe, and he was in and out of consciousness.
Bryony had to drive her husband to the nearest hospital to seek help. Happily, he survived. This service could save others the stress Bryony went through, and save lives. Madeline Ratcliffe, Sky News.
Well, as we've said, it's going to be hot today. Let's take a look at the forecast.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, today brings the peak of the heat with 34 degrees Celsius or 93 Fahrenheit possible in the southeast. England, Wales and the south of Ireland are enjoying a very sunny start, but further north there's more cloud with rain in places, and for many it's fairly warm already. England and Wales will hold on to the strong sunshine through the morning, albeit hazy at times. Most places there will turn out hot, very hot in the southeast, but sea breezes will cool some coasts.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
And now a quick reminder to be careful if you're out in the sun today. I'm sure no one needs to be told that, but new research from the consumer group Which has found that mineral-based sunscreens costing up to £28 have failed to provide the level of protection that they state on their packaging. The watchdog said that none of the 5 SPF 30 products they tested offered the level of protection claimed, so that's worth knowing. Now, coming up on Sky News Breakfast, I'm going to be joined by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, so do stay with me. Let's remind you of our top stories here this morning. And the boss of Heathrow has told Sky News it'll take more than a year to fix staffing issues as Gatwick cuts its summer flights in an attempt to limit further disruption. Boris Johnson will meet with a group of Tory MPs from the north of England today as he looks to alleviate pressure on his premiership and the cost of living. And temperatures are expected to hit 34 degrees in parts of the country on what's forecast to be the hottest day of the year so far. So let's get more then on our top story now. And Gatwick is cutting flights over the summer months to limit disruption for passengers. Well, earlier, the Minister for Small Business said that airports are facing a challenging situation, ramping up businesses following COVID restrictions. But Paul Scully also said the government wants the travel industry to do more to ensure that services run without disruption.
When you start up anything almost from scratch, because there were very, very few flights going through Heathrow at some points, that it takes time to come through and upskill the staff, bring the staff back in. So our ministers, transport ministers, have been trying to work with Heathrow, Gatwick or the other airport operators. We do want them to do more. We want to make sure that in a tight labour market there are enough people to staff the roles there, and we'll continue to work with them. There are a record number of vacancies, 1.3 million vacancies across the country in all manner of sectors, but there are also people who have recalibrated what they want to do when they're on furlough, and we want to make sure that those people that are not necessarily working full-time through universal credit, we can get them back into work to be more productive if that suits them, and obviously match them up with the sectors where there are those vacancies.
Well, our political correspondent, Rob Powell, is here with me. Morning to you. So many cost of living pressures around at the moment, and now added to people's misery, this news about more travel chaos at our airport. So what did you make of what the Minister had to say about that?
Absolutely. I think after 2 years of COVID, spiralling prices, people will be looking forward to a little bit of escapism. And the news this morning, warnings of industry problems for 12 to 18 months, Gatwick talking about cancelling flights as well. I think what I took from what Paul Scully was saying there is that in the short term anyway, there's not a lot the government can really do, because a lot of the problems here are being caused by people leaving the travel industry during COVID and leaving gaps essentially inside airports, inside airlines as well. And it's difficult to fill some of those gaps in the short term ahead of summer. He talked a lot about using work coaches and job centres to try and match people up with jobs. I think that will only solve the problem to an extent. And actually, from what we're seeing from Gatwick, it's inevitable that there is going to be some sort of disruption and cancelled flights in the months ahead. Broadly on cost of living as well. And in the same vein, Paul Scully admitting that the government cannot solve every problem and save every business in the coming months. So a fairly stark warning there. And on that question of tax cuts, which I think the Prime Minister is going to be hearing a lot about at a conference he's attending in the north of England to speak to Northern Tory MPs, many of whom won the seats in 2019. Many of those want to see tax cuts. I thought Paul Scully sounded very, very cold on that, though, talking about the Chancellor looking holistically at where we are. He said that we are a low-tax government. Of course, as you pointed out to him, they're not a very low-tax government at the moment. And then on that difficult political question of the Standards and Ethics Advisor resigning, I thought it was quite interesting that Paul Scully seemed to suggest he would be comfortable if there wasn't any standards advisor, as long as there was some sort of mechanism in place. I think realistically, given everything that's gone on in the last 6 months, it will be a very difficult look for Boris Johnson to pull off if he doesn't replace Lord Geidt.
Interesting to see where that one goes. Rob, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's stick with politics, shall we? Because the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, joins me now. Sir Ed Davey, welcome to the programme. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Let's kick off, shall we, with our top story today and the news that the boss of Heathrow is warning of disruption for 18 months in the travel industry. Gatwick Airport is also scaling back on the number of flights that it's putting on over the summer months. What can be done about this?
Well, it does look like a summer of discontent and a winter of chaos with the government. We've seen the problems at Gatwick and Heathrow and other airports. We're seeing flights cancelled. The government are failing on passports. I've got lots of constituents who've applied for passports and have not had responses after months. So there's a real chaos in government. The government should have started months ago helping and working with the transport industry. They failed to respond positively to many of the transport industry's requests, particularly on helping to get the staff we keep hearing about. So the government have acted too late. And frankly, the chaos we're seeing in the passport sector has made it even worse.
Well, the government says that it is working with the travel industry. I mean, what specifically would you like them to do?
Well, we've known for some time, and the transport industry was saying to the government months ago, that they needed to work with the industry to find people to do the jobs. And whether it's working with them on trying to recoach people, trying to bring them back, to coax them back. The government made it worse. They've increased taxes on the lowest paid. So, for example, they've frozen the income tax allowance. That means that some of the low paid are now being dragged into income tax, and that reduces the incentive to work. They've cut universal credit, which is supposed to help people back into work. So when we've got a cost of living crisis with interest rates going up, with prices, food and petrol prices going up, the government have been raising taxes on the very people who would be needed to fill the jobs at our airports. And we're hearing it on the doorsteps as we campaign. People are fed up with this government making the problems worse.
You talk about the problems with raising taxes, but cutting taxes is inflationary. And the Bank of England said yesterday that inflation could go up to 11%. We don't want to make that worse, do we?
Well, first of all, Liberal Democrats have argued that we need taxes to go up on the oil and gas companies so we can pay for a tax cut, a VAT cut of £600, which would really help people who are struggling. We need to cut taxes on people who are struggling. And frankly, I don't really buy this inflation argument. Much of the inflation is coming from abroad, because we're seeing the rises in energy costs, and we're also seeing the failure of the government to invest to get the growth. If we had a growing economy, actually we'd be able to supplying the goods, and there wouldn't be this problem of inflation. The government is making such a mess of our economy. We're seeing inflation go up, we're seeing growth go down, and people say, well, it's happening around the world. Well, other countries are struggling, that is true. But it's far worse in the UK. If you look at the growth figures and growth projections, the UK, I'm afraid to say, is the worst in the developed countries, with the one exception of Russia. That is how badly this Conservative government is handling the economy.
So just to be clear, your solution is to cut taxes and to increase spending?
No, the key thing is the tax cuts, because people need money now. They're really struggling with high food prices, higher petrol prices, interest rates going up. So people need some help now. That is the key thing. And the government could balance that by making sure the oil and gas companies really pay a fair share, that the tax they brought in really isn't anywhere near enough. And
so how big should the taxes be then on the oil and gas industry if the government's plans aren't adequate?
Well, we were proposing something twice as large as what the government had proposed, just to give you a size of it. And if we can get that money, we can make sure that there's no danger of inflation, because you're taking money out of very wealthy shareholders' pockets and you're putting it into the pockets of people who are struggling, people who would do the jobs at Gatwick and Heathrow if it was worth their while. We really have to have a fair approach to our economy, which will get the growth that we need and help people with the cost of living. I think the government have completely lost their way, and it's partly because they're not focused on the needs of ordinary people. They're focused on saving Boris Johnson's skin. We see it day in, day out at Parliament.
OK, and I want your thoughts before we go on Lord Guy's resignation, the ethics advisor to the Prime Minister. His resignation letter was published yesterday. What did you make of it?
Well, we have a Prime Minister who's broken the law, who's lost now 2 ethics advisors. People are supposed to advise him what is right and wrong. You have to draw your own conclusions. And we know he's broken the ministerial code. One really felt sorry for Lord Guy, having to work with a Prime Minister who's not fit to be the Prime Minister of our country. And just don't take my word for it. We are knocking on doors in a by-election in Devon, in Tiverton and Honiton, and people just want to see the back of Boris Johnson. If we could win that, it's going to be, I think, quite a close-run thing down in Devon. But if the Liberal Democrats could do what we did a year ago, when we took a chunk out of the blue wall in the shock win we had in Cheshire and Amersham in Buckinghamshire, if we could do that in Devon, that would really, I think, see the back of Boris Johnson.
OK. So, Ed Davey, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
So let's get more then on what's been yet another tough week for the Prime Minister. I'm joined now by the head of political polling at Opinion, Chris Curtis. Very good morning to you. It's been quite an extraordinary week, hasn't it, for the Prime Minister once again. Last week, of course, which feels like an age ago, we saw the vote of confidence. But this week, we've had a number of different policy announcements, as well as Lord Guy's resignation. So where has that left the PM's ratings?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, there's not very many weeks for the Prime Minister that aren't quite strange, I think, and we do seem to have quite a lot of this going on, and it's been going on for some time. But however dramatic this may seem to us, actually a lot of the polling we've seen over the past couple of weeks has shown that we haven't seen much more of a shift in the Prime Minister's ratings at all. If anything, he might have slightly improved his position. And the reason for that is because the public made up their mind on Boris Johnson quite some time ago. They thought he lied about Partygate, they don't trust what he has to say. And further resignations by an ethics commissioner, votes of confidence from the Conservative Party, they're not going to change anyone's minds. Boris Johnson's approval ratings have fallen quite dramatically, and at the moment he isn't doing enough to bring those approval ratings back up again.
And is there any indication of what could improve those figures?
I think what people liked about Boris Johnson, the reason that they voted for him in that 2019 general election is, he wasn't the most trustworthy person in the world. He wasn't the kind of person you'd buy a second-hand car off, but he was the kind of man who would get things done. And I think he needs to go back to that position of being seen by voters, being seen by the public, being seen by those people in the Red Wall as the kind of person who can get things done once again. And at the moment, given that the biggest problem facing voters in this country is cost of living, rising energy prices, he isn't seen to be getting anything done by voters to help them on that really crucial issue.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what the government plans are on that score. But he's also known as a survivor, isn't he? I mean, at what point could that reach a tipping point?
Well, I mean, lots of people would argue that we've probably passed that tipping point. If you look at the Prime Minister's approval ratings, they are the kind of approval ratings that you don't normally come back from. It'd be very rare for a Prime Minister to come back from them. That doesn't mean to say that Boris Johnson isn't going to be the exception, but he would be the exception if he ended up sort of bouncing back and winning the next general election, given where he currently is. Another thing that makes things more difficult is that he's lost the trust of voters. You know, over 6 in 10 voters say that they don't trust the Prime Minister. Now, when people don't trust you, it's very hard for them to listen and to believe anything you say, so it becomes even more difficult to turn that kind of polling around. So he's in a very difficult situation. I'm not saying it's impossible for him to come back, but I think it's going to be a real challenge for the Conservatives to come back under Boris Johnson.
And of course, he would argue that lots of the challenges that face the government at the moment are challenges that are faced worldwide in terms of pressures on the economy and the cost of living. I mean, to what extent is this personally being put at his door, all those kind of pressures that people are under?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And look, voters are actually fairly forgiving of things that are, outside of a Prime Minister's control. We were sitting in focus groups during the pandemic, for example, and lots of people would say Boris Johnson made mistakes, but he was in a very hard situation. And we do still hear some of that now. But I think it's clear that people are a lot less willing to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt than they used to, partly because of Partygate, partly because of all the sort of scandals that have surrounded the government. And that's why, the Prime Minister's finding it so much more difficult with the cost of living crisis than he was with those other issues that came before.
But as a general rule, if people end up feeling better off, does that make them more sympathetic towards the government?
Absolutely. And I think this is ultimately the government's biggest problem, is that we're about to go through a year where most people in this country, most swing voters, most people in every constituency are about to feel significantly worse off. That's going to be a difficult situation for the government, at any point. But when the government's going into that situation with a Prime Minister who's lost the trust of the British public, it's going to be incredibly difficult indeed. And
what about Labour? How are they doing? Are they managing to take advantage with the electorate of some of the Prime Minister's problems?
Well, I think it's certainly true that that things are a lot worse for the Conservatives than they are good for Labour. So when you ask voters, for example, a range of questions, who do you trust on the economy, who do you think would make the best Prime Minister, on whatever question you ask, the Conservative score has gone down quite dramatically. The Labour score's gone up slightly, but nowhere near as much as the Conservative score's gone down. So Labour still has a lot of work to do. Keir Starmer still has a lot of work to do to convince voters that they're ready for government. Significantly more people tell us still that Labour isn't ready for government than is ready for government. That Keir Starmer, doesn't at this stage look like a Prime Minister in waiting. So there is so much work that Labour needs to do to turn those numbers around still. They can't rest on their laurels. They can't just see the government that's in a really difficult situation and assume that that means they're going to end up in government.
Interesting stuff, fascinating times. Chris Curtis, thanks very much indeed for sharing your wisdom with us this morning. We appreciate it.